Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about visceral reflexes. Now, visceral reflex arcs have the same components as somatic reflex arcs. Remember, we have the receptor, sensory neuron, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. And although that's similar to somatic reflex arcs, there are some key differences here. Visceral reflex arcs have two consecutive neurons in the motor pathway because they're autonomic pathways. And then the afferent fibers are visceral sensory neurons rather than somatic sensory neurons. These are going to send info about chemical changes, stretch, or irritation of some of the viscera. And the cell bodies are located either in cranial nerve sensory ganglia or dorsal root ganglia of the spinal cord. So examples of a visceral reflex arc would be things like reflexes that empty the rectum and urinary bladder. So when the urinary bladder is stretched, there's receptors that can pick up that information. Those visceral sensory neurons then go back to the spinal cord and then synapse on the appropriate parasympathetic preganglionic neuron that then eventually sends motor information back out towards the bladder for bladder contraction. Same thing with the rectum too. Now, 3 neuron reflex arcs exist in the walls of the GI tract, and these involve the enteric nervous system, which are made of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, but the visceral sensory fibers involved in the phenomenon of referred pain as well. So if you look at an autonomic reflex arc, it looks a little different here, but it still has those 5 key components. So remember, we actually have our receptors in the viscera that receive stimuli, whether it's chemical stretch or pressure, and then that can be transduced into action potentials that are transmitted back towards the spinal cord through a visceral sensory neuron whose cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia. That'll synapse on a autonomic motor neuron in the lateral horn of the spinal cord, who's going to send its axon out through the ventral root and then along the spinal nerve through white rami communicantes. We're going to synapse on a postganglionic neuron here, and then that axon is going to go out the gray rami communicantes out towards the peripheral effector. But this is a motor neuron here, and so that's going to have a visceral motor effector response, whether it's cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Now remember, these are reflexes that just involve the viscera, but some reflexes can be modified by descending inputs from the brain. What's important to note here is that for individuals with spinal cord injury, where their brain no longer can communicate with certain segments of the spinal cord, sometimes these visceral reflexes get out of control, where someone's heart rate can just speed up abnormally and out of control as a consequence of these reflexes, but the brain can't inhibit that anymore because there's no communication if someone has spinal cord injury.